And we're back. Welcome to Bible Study Hub. My name is Noelle. I'm here with my husband, Jordan. We are your hosts tonight, and it is a pleasure because we get to kick you off in your new series in Exodus. And last year about this time, you all did a series in Genesis. And so this is a nice continuation of what you did last year. So it's a privilege to start you off with this. But I do feel it's been a year since Genesis, and that's a hearty book.
A lot goes on in there.
Before we get started in Exodus, how about we do just a really quick flyover of Genesis in case you've forgotten some stuff?
That's a great idea.
Sounds good. Okay, Start us out. How does it all begin?
Oh, why don't you get us going?
It all begins with God creating the earth. God sets this whole thing into motion, and very quickly we see sin enter the world. And the point that I'm going to just keep coming back to this entire time is the sovereignty of God, because he creates man, he creates this perfect, beautiful environment, and the enemy steps in to really throw some things off.
Try to exert his will on the situation.
And he's fairly successful at that, right?
Yes. Yep, at first. But God has a bigger and a better plan.
God has a bigger plan, and God sets into motion this incredible redemption arc that I don't think was ever within the idea of what could happen. When Satan decided to come in and try to mess this thing up, I can't imagine he
was contemplating that.
Yeah, he ever conceptualized that this was an option. And so man falls, man sins, and God goes, you know what? I'm going to solve this for you. And that's where we see this messianic plan come in. You're going to see us continuing to reference that because that's the overarching thread of the entire Bible, is this concept that we messed up. God cares so much about us and he wants to have a personal relationship with us that he sent Jesus to stand in our place for our sin. And we see this in Genesis 3:15, really famous verse. This is God speaking. He says, I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and her offspring. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. And he's talking about Jesus here. He's talking about that messianic plan to bring this all to a close, where Jesus is going to be triumphant. The Messiah is going to come. He's going to take over this thing. And so, given that Satan came onto the scene with this idea of, I'm going to cause sin to enter the world, going to destroy the whole plan, he now has to adapt to this new situation that we have going on. And we see this incredible story start to unfold in Genesis. And it really you start to see God's plan really unfold when Abraham enters the scene. And tell us a little bit about who Abraham was, for those of you who need a little refresher.
Abraham was the father of the Jewish people, and with whom God created a covenant.
Right. What's a covenant?
Covenant's a promise.
Yeah, we're going to talk about that a bunch tonight. God makes this promise, this covenant with Abraham, that all the nations of the earth are going to be blessed through him. And that blessing, again, we're going to keep coming back to this, that blessing is Jesus. And God in Genesis 15 makes this covenant with him, but then also gives him this additional information. You'll see this mentioning Abram. Abram and Abraham are the same guy. God has this tendency to change people's names. It's a really cool symbolic thing. Again, go back to the Genesis study to hear more about this. We're doing the flyover. But this is what God says, Genesis 15. Then the Lord said to Abram, know for certain that your offspring will be sojourners in a land that is not theirs, and will be servants there, and they will be afflicted for 400 years. But I will bring judgment on the nation that they serve, and afterward they shall come out with great possessions. So we start with this covenant, this promise. All the nations of the earth will be blessed through you. You, Abraham, are going to have children. And then God adds in this information about them being sojourners in a land. They're going to be servants there.
Yeah.
What's that about?
There is some, definitely some scary details for them in that prophecy that ends in deliverance.
Yeah, the story that we're going to be going into in Exodus and that we get to start you with today is actually that story. What God predicted hundreds of years beforehand when he said this to Abraham is this story of them going into Egypt, them being enslaved in Egypt, and then God miraculously delivering them out of Egypt, which is really cool. But you see all these ways during Genesis where the enemy comes in to try to mess things up. And we see that in the very, very beginning, where enemy comes in and he deceives Eve, and we end up with sin entering the world. Mm-hmm. And what's so encouraging about that is to see, even with that supernatural interference, God's plan still comes to pass. I think what's more encouraging for me in some ways is we also see God-fearing people in Genesis make some fairly egregious errors that, at least in my human mind, really could cause God's whole plan to go off.
And I
think
don't know
about
if you've
Abraham.
And I don't know if you've ever found yourself in a position where, oh, I made a mistake, God can't use me anymore.
Oh, yeah. Like where this was too bad.
Yeah.
We're now on to plan C.
Yeah.
Or D or E.
Yeah.
Or Z. Abraham made multiple mistakes like that.
Yes.
What can you think of a couple of those off the top of your head?
In specific, losing faith at times that he would bring forth the child of promise,
right.
And so had a son with Hagar.
Yeah, Ishmael.
Mm-hmm.
That was real bad. Hagar was not his wife. His wife was Sarah, and that was not how God planned bringing the nation of Israel in. But that's how Abraham decided to solve the problem. God, even out of that, continues his plan.
Yes.
And keeps his promise to Abraham.
Yes.
The sovereignty of God in this is amazing. We're going to keep talking about the sovereignty of God. If you had to describe or define sovereignty, what do we mean when we say the sovereignty of God? What would you say? What is that referring to in your mind?
God can do and will do what he desires to do, and he will effectuate his plan.
Yeah. Oh, beautiful. Succinct. Yeah. God will do what he wants to do. He will effectuate his plan 100%. So encouraging. If we fast forward a little bit in the book in Genesis, we see Joseph.
Yes.
Joseph's an important figure. Joseph has a hard time. His brothers hate him. God has given Joseph visions and prophecies of Joseph leading his brothers and being in charge. He gets into a rough spot. What happens with Joseph?
So Joseph gets a dream and delivers that dream to his brothers, who don't like the sound of that, and they decide to sell him into slavery.
First they try to kill him.
Yes.
And then they're like, there's a more profitable option, which is horrible. And another story where God's sovereignty is so on display.
Yes. And then he goes into he goes into Egypt, and Joseph's really a story of a recurrent faithfulness to God. Yes. He is really an admirable character.
Yeah.
And God uses him to accomplish amazing things. And
like country-changing, region-changing things in Egypt. He rules at a very, very high level in Egypt with people who are not his own people at all. He ultimately brings his entire family into Egypt, and he saves them all from a massive famine because God gave him this miraculous insight and this prophetic vision of what's going to happen, and so he gets prepared. Joseph was an icon. Joseph was a legend, and he was so highly venerated in Egypt and really saved not just Egypt, but also that whole region. So you can imagine how he's spoken about in just in daily life. People know who Joseph was even years afterwards. He's highly, highly regarded. And he's the one who brings in Israel, because he brings all of his brothers and all of their wives and all of their children into this part of Egypt called Goshen. You'll hear us talking about Goshen a lot in this study. And they begin multiplying, and they begin creating this nation that God promised to Abraham back hundreds of years now when we start getting into Exodus, hundreds of years before. So when we look at this story, again, that's God's sovereign hand. When people or the enemy come in and try to mess it up, God is so present, so aware, and you can't mess them up. And you can't get them off course. So that's the entry. That's sort of the landscape that we start with when we get into Exodus. So now we're going to take you into Exodus chapter 1. And what's interesting is when the Jewish people would have originally been reading this, they had a very different name for Exodus than we have for it now. They called it Shemot, which meant literally just names. Our word Exodus, which obviously to exit feels very normal, came much, much later. You'll see in just a moment why they called it Shemot, because I'm going to read you the first couple verses from Exodus. This is Exodus 1:1. These are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob, each with his household. Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, and Benjamin, Dan and Naphtali, Gad and Asher. All the descendants of Jacob were 70 persons. Joseph was already in Egypt. Then Joseph died, and all his brothers and all that generation. But the people of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly. They multiplied and grew exceedingly strong, so that the land was filled with them. So this is, you may recognize some of these names. These are the tribes of Israel, and you'll hear these referred to. So now you sort of understand why this is, why this was called names initially. It starts with all of these names and all of these people who come into Israel to begin building this nation. And it was important that they went into Egypt to do this instead of staying where they were. Where they were previous to this was in a place called Canaan. They were around the Canaanites. Jordan, why was it important for them to leave Canaan and come to Egypt to develop the nation of Israel as opposed to staying in Canaan?
Well, it was important for them not to intermix with other people groups.
Right. That's what God had determined. The Canaanites were very open and very welcoming and would have happily intermarried and done that. The Egyptians were a lot more limited in the types of intermarrying they would do, and thought very, very highly of themselves as a nation and as a people group, and so they were not going to... They did not routinely do that. So it was much easier for the Israelites to come in there and remain separate, which is what God had for them. They were going to remain separate. They were going to be their own nation, their own people. So that would have been a lot harder to do. They would have lost that in Canaan, whereas it wasn't as hard to do that there. So when we keep going down a little bit, we're going to go into Exodus 1:8, and I'm going to ask you all a question in a moment because I think this is very interesting. This is Exodus 1:8. Now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. And I'm going to stop for a moment because we've just talked for a moment about what a big deal Joseph was. He was this icon, legendary, saved the people from famine.
Extraordinarily important character.
So we're only like 300, 400 years after Joseph at this point. So this isn't thousands of years or 10,000 years. This isn't that long. This is, America's been around about that long. This king rises to power and doesn't know Joseph. Okay, so you, our friends watching, how is it that he didn't know who Joseph was? How is it that this king can just rise up and not know this guy?
Yeah. Joseph
was such a fantastic character. I mean, we all know Joseph, and I see a comment from Karen saying, I love the story of Joseph. Even most people who don't know the Bible or don't know God, they know the story of Joseph. Peggy says, love the story of Joseph from the pit to the palace. Rich says, Joseph overcame so many challenges because of God's calling on his life. This was the cost of a calling. These people, again, this is an incredible story. How is it that a king comes to power in Egypt who just doesn't know who this guy is? How does that just get lost? Margie says, a few hundred years had gone by. Yeah. Memories grow weak over a couple hundred years.
I was trying to think of a suitable analogy. I think we all know who George Washington is, right?
Right, yeah. Absolutely. It's a couple hundred years. I feel like maybe I don't know as many details about him as I could, but most people probably know George Washington, Ben Franklin. We were just touring Philadelphia, the historic area, the other day, so we feel like we're pretty in tune with that. So, I mean, a few hundred years is a long time, but those kinds of legendary, iconic characters really do persist. Roberta says the new king came from a different area. Roberta, an interesting idea. So if you've got a new king who's coming in, a new pharaoh who's coming in, who is not Egyptian, who maybe his people weren't around for that time, he wouldn't know it. Somebody else says, well, the story kept from him because he wasn't Egyptian. Over time, when the charm fades, maybe he would be a threat. Ooh, that's an interesting one. That over time, that story had actually morphed, and they didn't understand that true story. All fantastic ideas. You all are so smart. Yes, I think all of those are possible. We're going to talk about all of that in a minute. Let me continue reading this verse and then we're going to come back to it. Now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph, and he said to his people, behold, the people of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply. And if war breaks out, they join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land. That seems pretty dire circumstances there. Yeah, I love all of those options. Joseph was only about 300 years in the past. Let's go through a couple of those ideas you said. One of them was 300 years had passed. That's a long time. Absolutely, it's possible that over that amount of time, people just forgot. You know, it wasn't as present in our minds. And we go, well, we remember people from 300 years ago, but certainly those stories have changed and we don't necessarily understand it as viscerally, or maybe it's not as immediately relevant to my life. Again, I know the story of George Washington or of Thomas Jefferson or these other founding fathers of the United States, but that's not super impactful to me. My family wasn't here at that time. So it's possible it's something like that. There's another option, and somebody mentioned this. What if that king was from a different part of the world? What if he was from a different region? Is that possible?
Potentially.
Tell us about the Hyksos. That's the type of people, that's the name of the people who we think may have been in power at this time, who, to your point, would have been from a different part of the world.
Yeah, so the Hyksos were a group of people that immigrated to Egypt and took on the culture and the gods, but weren't from Egyptian heritage originally.
Yeah, and these guys, from what we know about them, there's a fair amount of writing about this group of people. They were nobility, they were very, very wealthy people. There was this time in Egyptian history that was highly dysfunctional, a lot of unrest, and they sort of came to rule during that time. So, if the Hyksos were in power during that time, yeah, it's very likely that they would not have known the story of Joseph. They would not have been aware of this. And so now they've got this people in the land in Goshen who are multiplying and who are really, really big. They don't know how they got there, why they're there. So that's possible. There was another suggestion, and that was maybe it is that this new king, he's been told the story's morphed. This is what I sort of would wager on, is you've got this new king who comes to power. Sure, he's heard the stories in the same way that we've heard stories of our country's history. And he goes, yeah, guys, I'm here to rule. I'm here to be effective. And I've got these people on my doorstep from some guy named Joseph who lived 300 years ago. I never met the dude. You're telling me we're giving these guys special treatment. They've got their own land. But look how big they're multiplying. I've got threats coming from the Hittites from the north. We need to get this under control. I'm more inclined to think it's a situation like that. Maybe he knew of Joseph, but he didn't remember him. He didn't care who Joseph was. Exactly. And so that's also a possibility.
Yeah.
Ultimately, the only thing that matters here is
that he didn't remember him.
He didn't remember him. And he has this really strong response to it going, we need to deal with these people. I like what Susie says. She goes, history was not handed down through the years. And Margie says he never took his history class. If he took it, he didn't take it very seriously. It didn't mean much to him. This guy is very, very concerned about the size of them. I think it's interesting where it says, let us deal shrewdly with them, they're getting really prosperous. They're really numerous. And this is one of the things that God does promise to Abraham, is that his descendants are going to be numerous. And he says more than the stars in the sky, or more than the sands on the shore. Lots and lots of people. And we see this sort of mass fruitfulness, multiplication happen here. And so he's looking at these guys and going, this is risky. We got a lot of people. They are not Egyptian. They are not part of our country. They were very, very separate. They had their own land called Goshen. He's going, this is risky. So any of those could explain why. But what matters here is we've got a king. We've got this Pharaoh who is very much not on board.
Exactly.
There's something interesting about this. The Pharaoh is never named. And you all probably already know this, but Pharaoh is like the title of king. The guy's name wasn't Pharaoh. Every new Pharaoh took on this title. So it's like king or president. You know, their name is not president. They take that on. We never see the Pharaoh named here.
No.
He doesn't get a name.
He's left nameless.
Why do you think that is? Moses is the guy who wrote this. Moses knew what the name of the guy was. Why do you think he chose not to name him? And let me say that to you, audience, as well, as I asked Jordan. Why do you, our audience who's watching right now, why do you think Moses chose not to tell us who this Pharaoh is? He chose not to name him in the book he wrote. Even though Moses, who we're going to get to in just a few weeks, Moses knew the name of the Pharaoh, and I'm sure he knew it intimately. I'm sure he was very, 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 very aware of who the Pharaoh was. Why did he choose to not name him in this? What are your thoughts?
Maybe I don't know. What do you think?
I think Moses hated the guy so much that he's like, I'm not even going to dignify you by giving you a name. That's sort of my thought on this. Yeah, Shirley's in agreement. She says not to give him any importance. And Emily says that he didn't name him intentionally. And it seems almost like this move out of almost like, I'm not going to respect you enough to give you a name here. It's not super important to the story because we're going to just keep referring to this guy as the Pharaoh, and he's going to be Pharaoh through this whole thing. And, you know, given what the options are for his name, it's probably a blessing to us that we don't have to try to pronounce that right now. But yeah, Moses decided he was not going to dignify this guy with a name. Let's keep going here. I want to go to Exodus 11. This is where this gets really, really hard. In Exodus 1:11, we start seeing what this Pharaoh decides to do about these people who are growing in number, getting out of control. It says, therefore they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with heavy burdens. They built for Pharaoh store cities, Pithom and Ramses. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied, and the more they spread abroad, and the Egyptians were in dread of the people of Israel. So they ruthlessly made the people of Israel work as slaves, and made their lives bitter with hard service, in mortar and brick, and in all kinds of work in the field. In all their work, they ruthlessly made them as slaves. This is, again, going to be an attempt by this man, I think very much influenced by the enemy, to annihilate the people of Israel. And we've seen this happen many times over the course of history, is that the people of Israel are in great, great danger. They're in great distress. They're under huge problems. What would be the incentive for the enemy at this time to try to wipe out the people of Israel? Why would he care about them existing?
I think it, in a way, ties back to that original prophecy that that he would bring forth the Messiah.
Yeah. So if we can avoid, if we can keep them from existing, then God can't bring the Messiah, because God specifically said the Messiah, the one who's going to save, is going to come through Israel. He's going to come through them. I want to come back to your comments for a moment, because still talking about what the reason was we didn't name him. I love these. His name was not that important. And Alan points out not many foreign kings are named in the Bible. There are a couple Assyrian kings that were unnamed but very prominent in the Old Testament. So this is also sort of seems to be a standard practice in many ways for the writers of the Old Testament to choose, we're not going to name these guys, we're going to name our guys, we're going to say who they were, we're not going to name these folks. And I love what Susie says, that the enemy was incentivized to annihilate these people in order to keep the Messiah from coming through that bloodline. Because if God made a promise, and if God said it, God has to do it. God's going to do it every single time. Exactly. Every promise he makes, he carries through. So I guess the strategy would be, if the enemy can prevent that prophecy from coming true, then I guess God's not God. Yeah. So I think that's kind of the thought process.
It's really interesting, though. You would think that Satan would have a better idea of God's sovereignty, but he keeps on acting like he has a shot.
Yeah, and I asked that earlier when we were preparing for this. We keep this entire story. We're only into the second book of the Bible. We're only, not that many generations into humanity as a whole. And how many times have we seen the enemy's plans thwarted by God? And not even thwarted is even too strong of a word. Thwarted indicates God's like, oh shoot, okay, I gotta figure out. It's just almost like, yeah, it's fine. And God just keeps doing what he was gonna do anyway. And I asked this question at the time, why even try to thwart the plans of God when it's just like the flip of a wrist, so easy to... God's like, yeah, my plans will not be thwarted. They cannot be overruled. What I want to have happen is going to happen no matter what, and it is going to happen. I find that really interesting. Peggy says, he who promised is faithful. Yeah, absolutely. And Susie says, the more the enemy fails, the madder he gets, and the harder he tries. That is kind of what it feels like, and we're about to see that progression of evil, I think, really come out. The level of wickedness that is about to be perpetrated on these people. We just read some of it. This hard labor. This forced working. And what we're going to see here in a moment, even pregnant women are conducting this hard working. They're making bricks in the hot sun, and they're working with kilns, and they're building. Laying brick is a very hard job. And they have these taskmasters. There's hieroglyphics picturing this, and these guys with whips going after them. It's just horrific. Emily says, I believe Satan knows the sovereignty of God, but he knows it hurts God every time he wins a battle with a non-believer, and he enjoys that. What do you think of that? Emily, as always, very astute. Very astute. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, he comes to steal, kill, and destroy.
It's in his nature to do it. And to Emily's point, if he can take one more down with him, great.
It's like he's just trying to blow things up as best he can on the way.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's and what's really hard about it, and it's why we don't talk about it lightly. Our lives are made so much worse because of it, and we've all encountered these situations that are fraught with sin and that have been demonstrably impacted by evil and by wickedness. And sometimes that's just the evil and wickedness of men, and men can be evil and wicked all on their own, no problem. And I think there is some of that happening from the Pharaoh. I think this was a wicked man doing wicked things. And then you see the enemy come in, and it's very evident that he's influencing the situation, making it all that much worse and all that much more destructive. Yeah, the Bible says he comes to steal, kill, and destroy. And what he's trying to do here with the people of Israel is he's trying to steal their birthright. He's trying to steal this promise that God has given. He's trying to kill them. And you're going to see even more of that happen here in a moment. And absolutely trying to destroy the thing that God has created and destroy this beautiful legacy that God has. Roberta says the enemy may have short-term memory loss and have forgotten. He keeps losing to God. And Kimberly says Satan is very pride-filled and he doesn't know the future, so he keeps at it. This is an important thing to note. He is not, the word we use is omniscient, all-knowing like God is. God knows everything. God knows the past, future, present. God knows everything all the time fully. The enemy does not. The angels do not. The fallen angels do not. So he has the same information we have. He also knows what's in this book. Mm-hmm. So he knows what God said.
Does he believe that God's a liar?
I don't think so, because God has never demonstrated that he's lied ever. And this book also says he's not. So he doesn't know everything. He does know what the end is. Because if we go to the very back of this book, it tells us what happens in the end. So that's right here. But this isn't his nature. He comes to steal, kill, and destroy. So what he's trying to do with the nation of Israel right now, he is trying to kill them. He's trying to work them to the brink and try to annihilate them that way. What's so interesting about this verse, it says, even as they're oppressed, the more they're oppressed, the more they multiply, the more they're fruitful. That's really incredible given it's being so clear how much hard labor they're under. And the Pharaoh was very clear. I want them to go down in number. They are too populous. This is a problem. We go to Exodus 15. Then the king comes up with a new plan. Then the king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah and the other Puah, get this, when you serve as midwife to the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stool, if it is a son, you shall kill him. But if it's a daughter, she shall live. Wow. This is a consistent play of the enemy to kill children and to kill babies. So we see this play continue, but it's really interesting that the Pharaoh decides to do it with these folks. The Pharaoh is nameless. The midwives here are not. We get their names. And one of the reasons we get their names are Shiphrah and Puah. These women are very brave. They're not the only two midwives in Israel. Like we talked about, Israel is exploding in population, exploding in growth. They would have had to have more midwives, but these are probably, two chief midwives. They're running an operation. And so the Pharaoh, super, super, super powerful man, says, you're going to kill all the baby boys who come out. As soon as they come out, you kill them. Now, this again works very well. Future Messiah is going to be male. We know that in Genesis 3, it's using male pronouns. If you can annihilate all the baby boys, no Messiah. This is what's so cool. It says, but the midwives feared God. They did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, and they let the male children live. Yeah. Bold move. It says they feared God. They didn't have the 10 Commandments at this point, by the way. That's going to come a little bit later. But God has always been very, 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 very clear. Do not kill. Do not spill the blood of another person. Do not murder is that key word. So they say, we're not going to do it. And the king of Egypt called the midwives and said to them, why have you done this? And why have you let the male children live? Pay very close attention to what they say. The midwives said to Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and they give birth before the midwife comes to them. So God dealt with the midwives. God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and grew very strong. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families. I'm going to share with you a little bit about that last verse here in a moment, but while I do that, I want to ask a question of what they said to the Pharaoh. I'm going to put it back up. He says, why have you done this? And they say, well, we've done this because the Hebrew women, they're not like the Egyptian women. They're vigorous. They give birth before we can get to them. That's why we've done this thing. Just very interesting thing to say. Let me ask you all this. Did the midwives lie to Pharaoh? And if they did, was that okay for them to lie? These are hard questions. So go ahead and answer that for a moment. Now, we have just a mild situation. I need to grab our cord to plug it in. So answer that. While I do, Jordan, at the end it says, and because the midwives feared God, he gave them families. Can you talk while I get that cord to plug this in? Can you tell what that means? Or would you like to get the cord?
I'll get the cord.
You get the cord. Midwives in the Jewish time, very generally, they did not have families. They were midwives because they could not be mothers. They were midwives because they were barren. So these are women who are going to be consistently, helping other people give birth. They're going to be helping with that situation, but they can't have this thing themselves. So what's so cool about this is God says to them, and I'm going to have to plug this in because I don't think there's a port there for you. No. I'm sorry we didn't plan on this, guys.
Not there.
No, there's none there. Here, we'll plug it in over here. I'm sorry, folks. You'd think we'd be better at this by this point. Yeah, we got it plugged in. We're all good. We can go for another 45 minutes if we want. So this is what's so cool about this. God says to them, you have been faithful. You have been barren. You've not been able to have kids. You will now be able to have kids, and he gives them families, this thing that they so desperately wanted. And I think that's a really cool thing. Here's what this also tells me. God dealt well with them. So to my question a moment ago, back here, did the midwives lie to the Pharaoh? If they did lie, was it okay that they lied? I think this is an interesting question. You've often heard this sort of moral conundrum, is it okay to lie in X situation? Is it okay to lie in this situation? Up here it says that they did not do what had been told of them because they feared God. And then when they get asked, they don't say, hey, we're not doing it because we fear God. They say, it's because the Hebrew women, they're not like your women. They're vigorous. They give birth before we can get there, so we don't even have a chance to kill them. I'm very curious what your thoughts on this are. Roberta says, I wonder how many midwives chose to ignore Pharaoh's orders. Based on the fact that the Pharaoh was so infuriated, I think these two did not give that command down. I think they made an executive decision between the two of them. We will not be doing this. This is not going to happen. Emily says maybe they partnered with the other midwives who made the gender call. If it was a male, they pretended they weren't there. So there's more than one way to skin a cat. Yeah. Somebody else says the two spies in Jericho certainly lied, and they were righteous. Interesting point. Lori says maybe they just took their good old time getting to the births. They didn't lie. They just instead of huffing it over there...
We'll get there eventually.
Just patted their way on over. Kimberly says there might have been an element of truth to their statement. Probably healthy and fit mothers because of all the hard work the Israelites do. That helps in labor. Plus, maybe not their first babies. They were very populous. Another great point. Susie says maybe they're telling the truth about the Hebrew women. They were strong workers, hard workers for many years during slavery. I love this. There are a lot of commentaries you can read that say... yeah, these women were working very, very, very hard, and that can help in labor, and they definitely were not like the Egyptian women who would have been living a lot easier lives. They were not subject to hard labor, so they didn't lie. Maybe they weren't entirely truthful, but, the Hebrew women weren't like the Egyptian women. And maybe to Lori's point, they didn't go on any mad dash to get over there. Maybe they took their time. Roberta says... maybe some of the Hebrew women had this happen, but I think these two did lie. Roberta, I'm actually in your camp. I think they did lie. But Jordan, what's your thought? What's your take on this? Did they lie?
They whatever they did, God honored them in it.
Does God honor lying? Let me ask you all. If they did lie, if they didn't lie, Is God okay with them lying? So this is why I'm with Roberta on this. Maybe there was an element of truth to this. Maybe they gave birth quickly. Sure, they weren't like the Egyptian women. That's not why they weren't killing the babies, though. We all know that's not why they were not doing it. It's not like, oh, if we could have gotten there in time, we would have killed them. God's not going to honor that. And we see God honoring them as righteous. So I think they did lie. Now we ask ourselves, okay, so if they did lie, and it says afterwards, God dealt well with these women, God then gave them families, this incredible gift. One of the things that we see, and we've talked about this before in Bible Study Hub, when we look at the way the Hebrew people really thought, sort of what their conception was, we think in these very black and white terms, very binary. They didn't necessarily construct their thought processes on this. And we've talked about this many times. This is why they're fantastic and still dominate the field in physics. Absolutely amazing in physics. They're not working on these like linear binary ideas. And I think that's one of the areas that applies here. We see lots of people in Scripture, especially in the Old Testament, who lie. And God calls them righteous, as one of our folks commented as well. God says they're righteous. God blesses them. I think they did lie. This is not why they weren't killing the babies. Because if this was the only reason why, we couldn't get to them on time, God would not have blessed them for that. God chooses to bless them. One of the things that we know is that God holds human life in the absolute highest value, and especially innocent human life. And we think about who is the most innocent of any of us. It's going to be babies, newborn babies, preborn. I mean, these are little babies. They're helpless. They haven't done anything to deserve anything. They're babies. God honors those who protect human life. And so if you have a choice and you lie to protect human life, my view of it is, my scriptures I think say, that is the reason to lie. You've got a higher moral good to protect human life. Somebody referenced those spies in Israel. When we see Rahab lie, and she did lie, no, there's nobody here. That was to protect their lives, because if they'd found them, they would have killed them. And we see that sort of lying happen. And when the lying happens to protect human life and to directly save somebody's life, in this case, the lives of all of the male babies, that changes things. But this is a very controversial viewpoint. I had the privilege of being at Summit Ministries a few years ago, where one of the students brought this up. And it was a vigorous debate between them on, is it okay to lie to save human life? Because there's an alternative viewpoint on this that says God is sovereign. And because God is sovereign, even if you tell the truth and in your human mind it's going to result in somebody dying, God will solve that. And God will take care of that. And so there was this very, very vigorous debate among these high school and college students and these theologians who were there going, is this okay? Is this not okay? When is it okay? When I look at this, I see people doing it and I see God blessing that. And Sandy says, and I think this is so important, it is better to obey God than it is to obey man. Mm-hmm. And that's even what we see Paul say later. Paul or Peter in the New Testament say, would you have me obey government and disobey God? And they're all kind of quiet to that one, because it's like, we don't have a choice on this one. We have to obey God first. We have to do that. But like I said, that's sort of a controversial idea. And especially as we've been talking about the sovereignty of God, that's a hard one to rectify in some ways. Yeah, exactly. You all have been very generous to have those conversations with us and to think about those hard things. This is one of those things that is very challenging to come up with. So these two brave, committed, godly women, they save so many. They save so many. So again, we see this evil plan. It can't come to fruition. God saves them. God saves these babies from being killed. Last verse. Exodus 1:22. Then Pharaoh commanded all his people. Now he's not even talking to Israel. Every son that is born to the Hebrews, you shall cast into the Nile, but you shall let every daughter live. So he's now taken out the factor of the Israelites. He's taken out the midwives from this equation. He's going, all right, my people, every baby boy you see that's born to a Hebrew, throw them into the Nile. And the Nile's full of crocodiles, aside from the fact that it's just rushing water and it's going to drown someone. It's full of crocodiles. Interestingly, the word Pharaoh also means crocodile. So this is an evil man. He is absolutely dead set on those baby boys being killed. And we're going to leave you on a cliffhanger today. Because you need to come back to find out what happens next. Because again, it looks dire. It was infanticide. The midwives saved this. He's trying to just work them to death. God still prospers them. Now he's going to try to have them all thrown into the Nile to, again, cut this thing off, annihilate this population, remove the opportunity for the Messiah to come. These people are going to be subjugated one way or another. So you have to come back next week to find out what else happens. Thank you so much for being with us. This is always a privilege to do this with you guys. We love it. And Jordan, can I ask you to close us out in prayer?
Yes. Lord, we love you. And thank you that we can gather here and learn about you and your story, Father. And we just thank you for your sovereignty, Lord, and we acknowledge that. And your unbreakable grip, Lord, on all of us. And thank you, Lord, for finishing our salvation, Lord, and thwarting every futile attempt of the enemy to upset your plan for us, Lord. And we love you. Please bless us this week, Lord, as we continue to dig into the Word, Father, and I pray that you would illuminate it with your Spirit. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. Thank you again for joining us. It was a pleasure to be with you, and what a privilege to open up Exodus with you all. Make sure you tune in again next week, 9 p.m. Eastern Time on Bible Study Hub. If you're not part of the Facebook group, join the Facebook group. Best group of people you're going to find. Have a wonderful night. Go out there, live for Jesus, make good decisions, team. Good night.
Night.